I didn't know that morning that a gesture of Tourier's would change two lives, mine and someone else's, someone I didn't even know. But this only became clear years later. One afternoon when I could barely breathe and life seemed to be saying goodbye to me without warning. Sometimes I wonder, how many things do we do without realizing the weight they carry? How many gestures leave our hands and travel silently through time until they find the right moment to return? I was 60 years old when it happened. 60 years of an ordinary life, without great achievements, without extraordinary stories to tell. I woke up early, worked, came home, took care of my things. Nothing special. Nothing that seemed important enough to be remembered. But there's something about simplicity that you only understand later. Something about ordinary days that, suddenly, cease to be ordinary. Before we begin, if this type of story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be notified whenever a new narrative like this is shared here. These are simple, human stories, meant to be listened to calmly perhaps when you need them most. It was a Monday, I remember, because Mondays always had that weight of a new beginning. That feeling that the whole week is ahead of you, waiting. The bus stop was crowded, as always. Tired people, hurried people, people who don't even look around because they're thinking about everything they need to do. I was there, in line, waiting my turn, when I noticed a young man in front of me. He must have been in his early 20s, maybe younger. He was holding a slightly crumpled briefcase under his arm and seemed nervous. The kind of nervousness you recognize when you've been through it, before the kind that comes before something important. The bus stopped. The doors opened. The line started moving. When it was his turn, the boy reached into his pocket, searched again. He turned his pocket inside out. 2 coins fell into his palm. He counted them quietly, looked at the driver, and I saw his expression change. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was that worst thing, that kind of silent defeat you feel when life reminds you, in a small way, that you have no control over anything. 2 riets are missing, he said, almost in a whisper. The driver didn't even blink and get out next to the foyer juste à second. But in that second, I saw something break inside him. He swallowed hard, started to take a step back, and the line was already pushing. Already complaining because Monday waits for no one. I didn't even think about it. I simply held out my hand with 2 coins and said, "Take it, go." He looked at me. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but he didn't. He just took the coins, went through the turnstile, and headed for the back of the bus without looking back. I went in right after, paid my fare, and sat in a seat near the window. The young man was standing in the back, looking out the window with his briefcase pressed against his chest. He didn't look for me. He didn't come to thank me. And I didn't expect him to, because it wasn't a favor. It was just what had to be done. The bus drove off. I got off at my stop. It continued on. And I never thought about it again. Life went back to how it always was. Same days. Work. Home. Silence. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't happy in that way people talk about, you know? That full, overflowing kind of happiness. I was just being. I simply was. The years passed slowly, but they passed. Enduitem, 79 but première feltit. A kind of weariness that wasn't physical. It was from within, as if I had lived everything I had to live, and now all that remained was to wait for time to pass. I started to notice that I was becoming quieter, more withdrawn, less interested in things. It wasn't depression, at least. Not in the way people describe it. It was more like the world had become a little more distant. Like I was watching my own life from afar. And then, one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Premier wa teom tiding, I felt the kitchen in my chest. I thought it was heartburn. But the pain didn't go away. It stayed, and it grew. It grew in a way that made me sit down in my chair and grip the edge of the table tightly. My breath went short, my heart raced, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fear, real fear. I managed to get the phone. I managed to call emergency services. I managed to give them my address. And after that, everything got blurry. Flashing lights, voices, hands grabbing me, the sound of the siren, and that feeling that maybe I wasn't going to wake up this time. But première occupée. I woke up in a hospital room, surrounded by the smell of alcohol and medicine, with the soft beeping of monitors beside me. And when I opened my eyes, someone was there. A young doctor in a white coat, checking the equipment. He must have been in his early 30s, maybe younger. Calm face, attentive gaze. He noticed I was awake and smiled. "Welcome back," he said, in a voice that sounded genuinely relieved. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. He brought me water. He helped me drink slowly. And he stayed there, by my side, while I tried to understand what had happened. "You had a minor heart attack," he explained, "but you're stable now. You'll be fine." I nodded, still dizzy, still confused. And that's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't just doing his job. There was something in the way he looked at me, something in the attention he gave me, as if he were there not just because he was a doctor, but because he wanted to be. And then, before leaving the room, he stopped at the door. "Es-tu honnête, Tom?" And he said something that made the whole world stop for a second. Years ago, a woman paid for my bus fare. "Tu aurais?" I was going to a job interview and didn't have the full amount. If she hadn't done that, I would have missed that interview. And I would have missed the chance that changed my life. My heart, which was already weak, seemed to skip a beat. Esmailed, a small smile, but one filled with something I couldn't name. I never forgot her face. And he left. And I stayed there, alone, holding my breath. A huge question echoed inside me. Could it be? I spent the entire night awake. Not because the pain had returned. Not because the monitors were beeping or because a nurse had entered the room. I spent the night awake because I couldn't stop thinking about those words. I never forgot her face. Could it have been me? Could that nervous young man at the bus stop years ago, clutching a crumpled briefcase with no money for the fare, could that have been him? I tried to remember the face. I tried to pull from my memory some detail that could confirm it. But faces get blurred over time, don't they? We see so many people every day, so many people who come and go from our lives without leaving a mark, that in the end everything becomes a kind of blur. But that morning I remembered. I remembered his nervousness. I remembered the briefcase. I remembered the 2 coins falling into his palm and the look of defeat on his face when he realized it wouldn't be enough. I remembered reaching out my hand. I remembered that he hadn't thanked me. And I remembered thinking that it didn't matter. But what if it did matter? What if that gesture, those 2 riets that I wouldn't think twice about spending on any nonsense, had actually changed someone's life? I always thought that the things we do don't have that much weight, that life is too big, too complex, for a small gesture to make a real difference. But now, lying in that hospital bed, With my body still weak and my mind racing, I started to wonder if I hadn't been wrong all along. By the time the sun started streaming through the window, I had already given up on sleeping. A nurse came in to check my vitals. She was friendly, efficient, but rushed. She did what she had to do and left. Soon after, someone else brought breakfast. I ate without tasting it. My mind was elsewhere. I wanted him to come back. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know. I wanted to understand if what I was feeling, that strange mixture of surprise, relief, and something I couldn't name, made any sense. But he didn't come back. The morning passed. The afternoon began. Other doctors came and went. Test à l'attentive. But none of them was him. And the more time passed, the more I began to think that I had imagined it all. Maybe the medication had confused me. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe it was all just a strange coincidence, one of those things a tired mind invents to make sense of what has none. It wasn't until late afternoon that he reappeared. He entered the room with the same calm as before, checked the monitors, made some notes on his clipboard. I remained silent, observing, waiting. He finished writing, put the pen in his lab coat pocket, and then looked at me. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I replied, and it was true. Physically, I was better. But inside, I was completely turned upside down. He nodded, satisfied. "Great. The tests are good. If everything continues like this, you should be discharged tomorrow or the day after tomorrow." I knew it was time to ask. I knew that if I didn't ask now, I might not have another chance. But the words wouldn't come out. They were stuck in my throat, heavy, as if afraid of what he might answer. He was already leaving when I finally managed to speak. "What you said yesterday about the bus fare." He stopped. He turned around slowly, and she smiled. "You want to know if it was you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, as if he knew exactly what had been going through my head since he'd left that room. I just looked at him, and he pulled up a chair, sat down next to my bed, and for the first time since all this had started, I felt like I was going to get an answer. "It was a Monday," he began, and my heart skipped a beat. I had a job interview scheduled for 9 in the morning. It was for an administrative assistant position at a hospital. Nothing grand, but it was what I needed at the time. I had been unemployed for months, living at a cousin's house with no money, no prospects. That interview was all I had. He paused as if reliving that moment. I woke up early, got ready as best I could, grabbed my briefcase with my documents, and left. But when I got to the bus stop, I realized I'd forgotten to pack the fare. I rummaged through my pockets. I found some coins. I counted them. Os R$2 shorty. I was gripping the sheet so tightly that my fingers were white. I got on the bus thinking the driver might let me through, but he didn't. He told me to get off, and I was going to get off. I was going to miss the interview. I was going to lose the only chance I had to start over. He looked directly into my eyes. Then a woman behind me held out her hand with 2 coins and said, "Take these. Go." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I was paralyzed. I took the coins, went through the turnstile, and went to the back of the bus. And I felt like the worst human being in the world because I didn't even thank her properly. I just left. I got off at my stop, went to the interview, and spent the whole day thinking that I should have gone back. I should have looked for that woman. I should have said something. He gave a sad smile, but I didn't go back, and I never saw her again. Until yesterday. The silence that fell between us was heavy, but It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people understand something important at the same time. Did you get the job? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He nodded. I did it. I started as an administrative assistant. I worked hard, very hard. One of the doctors who worked there noticed I was interested in the field, encouraged me a scholarship I took year. But I graduated, and now I'm here. He looked around the room as if he was seeing it all for the first time. All because of 2 years I didn't know processes. Because for years I lived thinking that nothing I did mattered. That I was just another person passing through life, without leaving a mark, without making a difference. And now this man was telling me that a gesture I didn't even remember clearly had changed his entire life. I didn't do anything special, I said, and my voice came out weaker than I expected. He shook his head. You did. You just didn't realize it. Then he stood up, straightened his lab coat, and before leaving, said one more thing. You know what's funny? I spent years thinking about that day, thinking about how I would never be able to thank you. And then you show up here, needing help, and I finally have the chance to do for you what you did for me. He smiled again. That small smile, but full of meaning. Sometimes life has a strange way of closing cycles. And he left, and I stayed there with tears in my eyes. For the first time in years, feeling maybe, just maybe, my life would have been worthwhile. I was discharged 2 days later. When I left the hospital, the world seemed different. It wasn't the sunlight, or the fresh air, or the city noise I hadn't heard in days. It was something internal, something that had shifted within me and now occupied a new place. I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, in those words that he had spoken with such simplicity, but which carried enormous weight. Because after I throughout life, I believed that great things were done by great people. People with money, with power, with influence. People who could change laws, build hospitals, save lives in evident and undeniable ways. I never thought someone like me could make a difference. Because what was I? An ordinary woman. I worked, paid my bills, lived my life without drawing attention to myself. I didn't have a fortune to donate. I didn't have time to do volunteer work. I didn't have anything that seemed grand enough to matter. And then I discovered that I had changed someone's life without even realizing it. That a gesture made without thinking, without expecting anything in return, without even remembering it afterward, had spanned years and returned to me when I needed it most. And that affected me in a way I wasn't prepared for. During the first few days at home, I stayed quiet. I spent a lot of time sitting Ruruno, Juting King. My daughter called every day, worried, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. I told her yes, that I was fine, that I didn't need anything, but that wasn't true. I needed to understand what that meant. Because if such a small gesture had made such a difference, then what else had I done without realizing it? What else could I have done that I didn't do because I thought it didn't matter? And, more importantly, what else could I do? I spent entire days revisiting my life in my memory, trying to remember other moments, other gestures, other people. How many times had I walked past someone who needed help and pretended not to see them because I was in a hurry? How many times had I listened to someone vent and offered quick advice just to end the conversation? How many times had I chosen the comfort of indifference instead of the discomfort of being present? There weren't many, but there weren't few either. And each memory came with a strange feeling, not exactly guilt, but something like regret. The kind of regret that comes when you realize you could have done things differently. But you didn't because you didn't know it mattered. But now I knew, and knowing changed everything. I started paying attention to things. Things that used to go unnoticed. Things that I considered too small to be worthwhile. A neighbor who lived alone and always seemed tired. I'd never really talked to her much. I'd just wave when I saw her on the stairs. But now, when I saw her, I'd stop. I'd ask how she was, if she needed anything, if she wanted a coffee. At first, she was surprised, suspicious, even, as if she wasn't used to someone caring. But little shoppined up. And I discovered that she had lost her husband 2 years ago and since then had been living a kind of autopilot, jeu existing, without really. It's strange, she told me one afternoon, while we were having tea in my living room. We think life goes on the same after someone leaves. But it doesn't. It becomes empty, and we don't know what to do with that emptiness. She stirred the tea slowly with her spoon, gazing at the liquid as if she could find answers there. In the beginning, everyone shows up. They bring food, call, ask if you need anything. But after a few weeks, their lives go back to normal, and you're left alone with the silence. And that silence, it screams. I understood exactly what she meant, because I also lived like that for a long time. Not because someone had died, but because something inside me had fallen asleep. Something that made me feel connected to life, to people, to the world. And now, for the first time in years, it was waking up. We started meeting more often, sometimes just for tea, sometimes for a walk in the nearby park, sometimes just to sit in silence, side by side, because it's not always necessary to fill the void with words. And I watched her change, slowly, like a plant that receives water after a long dry spell. She began to smile more, to talk about plans, small plans, like tidying up the balcony, garden, like getting back to reading the books she had abandoned. You know, she told me during one of those meetings, I think I'd forgotten I was still alive. Like, breathing, functioning, but not really living. You reminded me of that. I didn't know what to say. Because I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I had just been there. But perhaps that was exactly it. Perhaps just being there was extraordinary in a world where everyone is always leaving. I started noticing other things as well. The young man who worked at the bakery always seemed rushed, stressed, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I started greeting him by name, asking him how his day had been, leaving a tip even when it wasn't necessary. At first, he responded automatically, "Okay, thanks." But after a few weeks, he started to really respond, talking about his sick mother, about the second job he had to pay the bills, about the tiredness that seemed endless. There are days when I wake up and think, what's the point? He told me one morning while wrapping my bread. I work, and at the end of the month there's barely anything left. And then I think, is that all there is? Is that what life is? He wasn't expecting an answer. He was just venting. And I just listened. He didn't give advice. He didn't try to solve problems. He just listened. And I realized that sometimes that's all people need. Someone to listen. Someone to see. Someone to acknowledge that they exist and that what they are going through matters. There was one time when he thanked me. You know, ma'am, you're the only person here who treats me like a human being. Everyone else just wants their bread and change. Nobody asks how I am. He said this with tears in his eyes. And I felt a tightness in my chest. Because how many people had I treated like that throughout my life? How many times had I taken my bread, my change, and left without even looking properly at the person who was serving me? I didn't do it on purpose. Nobody does. We're just tired, busy, thinking about 1,000 things at once. But for the person on the other side, it hurts. It reinforces the feeling of invisibility that many people carry. And I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. I also began to notice that my way of seeing the world was changing. Before, when I went out on the street, I only saw what was on the surface. People rushing by, cars honking, endless lines. Everything seemed grey, monotonous, repetitive. But now I could see more. I saw the woman at the bus stop, holding her young daughter's hand tightly, and I wondered what kind of day she'd had. I saw the man sitting in the square feeding the pigeons, and I wondered if he was alone, if someone was waiting for him at home. I saw the young woman at the supermarket checkout forcing a polite smile, and I wondered how many times a day she had to pretend she was okay. And whenever I could, I tried to do something. Sometimes it was just a genuine smile. Sometimes it was a heartfelt thank you. Sometimes it was asking how are you? And truly waiting for the answer. Small gestures. Almost imperceptible. But I was beginning to understand that it is precisely these gestures that build a life. Not the grand moments, not the remarkable achievements, but the small encounters, the small choices, the small acts of presence that, added together, form the fabric of who we are. I started paying attention to how I felt, too, because something was changing. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that I could point to and say, look, here, this is where it changed. It was more subtle, like an underground current that you don't see, but you feel the effects on the surface. I was sleeping better. I woke up feeling more refreshed. The things that used to irritate me, the noise of the traffic, the supermarket queue, the slow service didn't bother me as much. Or rather, they still bothered me, but I didn't let them control me. It was as if I had more inner space. As if, by opening myself up to others, I had also opened myself up to myself, and the people around me were different, too. Not because they had changed, but because I was seeing them in a different way. My daughter, for example. We've always had a distant relationship, not for lack of love, but for lack of connection, perhaps. She lived her life, I lived mine, and we only met on special occasions, in those polite and superficial conversations we have when we don't quite know what to say. But after I left the hospital, I started calling her more often, not to ask for anything, just to talk. To ask how she was doing, to tell her about my day, to laugh about some silly thing that had happened. And at first, she was suspicious, as if she were expecting me to ask for something, to demand something. But when she realized that I just wanted to be present, she started to open up too. She told me about the job that was leaving her exhausted. About the boss who never recognized her effort. About the nights she came home so tired she could barely eat dinner before collapsing into bed. She told me about the relationship that was going through a difficult phase. About the arguments that kept repeating themselves for the same reasons. About the feeling of always chasing after something without ever achieving it. She told me about the loneliness she felt even when surrounded by people, about the feeling that no one really saw her, not really, and I just listened, just like I listened to the neighbor, just like I listened to the boy at the bakery, because I was beginning to understand that the greatest gift we can give someone isn't money, it isn't a solution, it isn't advice, it's presence. In other words, through our actions, our words, our time, you matter. What you are experiencing matters. I see you. And gradually, without me realizing it, things started to change again. Not in a magical way. Not in a way that would suddenly make everything perfect. But in a real way. In a way that made sense. My daughter started calling me more often too. Not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to. We started having lunch together, talking about real things, not just the weather or traffic. One day, she told me something that caught me by surprise. Mom, I always thought we didn't have much in common, that we were very different. But now I realize that we just never really got to know each other. And she was right. Because we can live alongside someone for years and never truly know that person. Never truly see who they are beneath the layers we all wear to protect ourselves. And this applies to everyone, to the neighbors, to the co-workers, to the people we cross paths with every day. We assume we know, but we don't, because knowing requires presence. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to see beyond the surface. And I was learning how to do that. I was learning to truly see, to truly listen, to truly be present. And the more I did that, the more life opened up. My neighbors started going out more, smiling more, having that sparkle in her eye that people have when they feel life is still worth living. She told me she had signed up for a cooking course, something you've always wanted to do but never had the courage to. You showed me that there's still time, she said. That life doesn't end just because we get old or because we lose someone. Life goes, and we can choose how to live what's left. The guy at the bakery told me he'd gotten a better job, that he'd be able to quit his second job, that he'd finally be able to sleep properly, that he'd be able to spend more time with his mother. You gave me hope, he said. You made me believe I deserved better. And that made all the difference. And every time something like that happened, I felt something strange. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Not gratitude for being alive. Not gratitude for having health or a roof over my head. But gratitude for being a part of all this. For being connected to these people. For realizing that, in some way, my presence mattered. I was no longer that woman who lived on autopilot, just letting the days go by. I was present. I was seeing. I was feeling. And life, in some way, was answering me. One day I was coming back from the market, carrying my shopping bags, when a young woman stopped beside me. Excuse me for bothering you, but are you all right? These bags look heavy. I looked at her, surprised. She must have been in her early 20s. Her hair was tied in a ponytail. She was dressed simply. She had a kind look in her eyes. Yes, thank you, I said, but she didn't leave. Let me help you. I'm going in that direction. And before I could protest, she grabbed half the bags and started walking beside me. We talked during the drive. She told me she was a nursing student, that she lived nearby, that she liked to help people whenever she could. My grandmother always said that you never know when a small gesture can make a difference in someone's life. And I've always believed that. She talked about how she had chosen nursing precisely for that reason, because she wanted to be close to people during their most vulnerable moments. Because she believed that caring for someone went far beyond technique and procedures. Some people just need to feel that they're not alone, you know? And sometimes we can be that presence, even without doing anything grand When we arrived at my building, she handed me the bags, smiled, and left. And I stood there, on the sidewalk, bags in my hands and tears in my eyes. Because, for the first time, I understood completely. Vad hände de years ago höll through Dr. pred. It had created waves. Waves that touched other people. That inspired other gestures. That continued, moving far beyond what I could see or imagine. And now, those waves were coming back to me in ways I never imagined. Not only through people I had helped directly, but also through people who had been touched by other people who, perhaps in some way, had been touched by me. It was as if an invisible network connected us all. And every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every choice to see and be seen, strengthened that network. And the stronger she became, the more she supported us. All of us. I started to notice a pattern. It was no coincidence. It couldn't be. The more present I was, the more attention, kindness, and availability I offered without expecting anything in return. Simply because it felt right, the more life gave back to me in the same way. Not in a direct way. Not like a commercial transaction where you give something and receive exactly that back, but in a deeper, more complex way. As if the world were responding to my inner state in a way I had never noticed before, because I had changed. Not just in what I did, but in how I felt when I did it. Before, when I helped someone and I did help, occasionally there was always a part of me that expected recognition, a thank you, confirmation that it had been worthwhile. And when it didn't come, I felt a little frustrated, a little resentful, even. But now it was different. Now I did things simply because they needed to be done, because I could do them, because, in some strange way, doing them made me feel more whole. And the more I lived like that, the more I noticed things happening around me. Small things. Things I would have previously ignored or attributed to chance. Like the time I was in a bank line, waiting for almost 40 minutes, and suddenly one of the tellers opened a new window and called me first, even though there were people ahead of me. Or the time I missed my bus by seconds and the driver, who had already closed the doors, saw it in the mirror, stopped and opened it again. Small acts of kindness, small openings, small conveniences that made the days lighter. And I know it sounds silly. I know it sounds like the kind of thing anyone could call coincidence, luck, timing, and maybe it was. But there was something about how often this was happening that made me think differently. It was as if, by changing the way I saw people, by changing the energy I brought to the world had also changed the way it saw me. I couldn't explain it. I did it but première felt. It was around that time that I met Regina. Regina had lived in my building for years, but we had never really talked. She was a reserved, serious woman, the kind who greets you with a nod and moves on. I always respected her space. I never forced a conversation. But one day, I found her sitting on the building staircase, her head in her hands, clearly shaken. I could have walked right past. I could have pretended I didn't see. I could have thought, it's none of my business. She doesn't like to talk anyway. But I didn't do that. I stopped. I sat down next to her. I was silent for a moment, and then I asked, softly, "Are you well?" She lifted her head. Her eyes were red, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed vulnerable. "No," she said, and her voice broke. I didn't insist. I just stood there, and after a few minutes, she started talking. She told me she had just received a diagnosis, cancer, early stage, treatable, but frightening. She told me she lived alone, that she had no one close to her, that she was afraid to go through this without support. "I've always been very independent," she said, wiping away tears. "I always thought I didn't need anyone. But no, now I don't know what to do." I held her hand. "You don't need to know now. We'll figure it out together." And that's what we did. In the following days, I began to accompany her, first simply offering company to the appointments, then bringing her food when she was too weak to cook, then simply sitting beside her when the anguish became overwhelming and she needed someone just to be there. I didn't do it expecting anything. I didn't do it thinking she owed me anything. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because I understood what it was like to feel alone, because I knew that sometimes having someone around is enough. And over the weeks, I saw Regina change. Not just physically the treatment was working, but internally, she began to smile more. Total humor. To open up in ways she probably never allowed herself to before. One afternoon, she told me about her marriage, about how she had shut herself off after her husband died, about how she had built walls around herself because she thought it was the only way to avoid suffering again. "But walls don't protect us from pain," she said, looking at the teacup in her hands. "They only isolate us from life." And when she said that, something clicked inside me. Because I had been exactly like that too. For years, I lived a closed-off life. Not because I was bad, not because I didn't care, but because I believed that everyone had to deal with their own problems. That offering unsolicited help was intrusive. That people preferred to be left alone. And perhaps some would have preferred that, but many wouldn't. Many were waiting, silently, for someone to notice, for someone to care, for someone to reach out. And now I was being that person. And the more I gave, the more I received in return. Not from Regina, not directly, but from other places. Unnoticed. Like the day my car broke down in the middle of the street, and a man who was passing by, without knowing me, stopped to help. He stayed with me until the tow truck arrived. He didn't want anything in return. He just said, "We need to help each other, right?" The world is already hard enough. Or like the time I was at the market, counting the change at the checkout, and I realized I was a few cents short. The girl behind me held out her hand with the coins. "Here, you can keep them." Every time something like that happened, I felt a chill, because they were the same gestures I was making, only going back. And I began to understand something fundamental. What we put out into the world doesn't stay still. It doesn't disappear. It moves. It spreads. It touches other people. And eventually it comes back. Not because the universe is magical. Not because there's a cosmic bank account making fair trades. But because when you change the way you relate to the world changes the way it relates to you. I was more open, more present, more available. And the people around me were responding to that. Not all of them, not always, but enough for me to realize that something was different. Regina got better. The treatment worked. And when she received the news that she was cancer-free, she hugged me and cried. "I wouldn't have made it without you." I wanted to say yes, that she would, that she was strong. But I didn't say it. I just hugged her back, because maybe she really couldn't have done it alone. And maybe neither could I. Maybe we need each other in ways we don't admit, because we've been taught that independence is a virtue and need is a weakness. But it isn't. To need is human. To help is human. To be present is human. And when we allow that, When we truly allow it, life becomes lighter. Not perfect, not painless. Büyükleite. It was around that same time that something happened to the boy from the bakery. I kept going to the place, kept talking to him, asking how he was doing, leaving tips when I could. And over the months, we had developed a kind of silent friendship. The kind that doesn't need many words, but is real nonetheless. One day, he told me he had received a job offer elsewhere. A better job with a fixed salary, benefits, and fairer hours. But he was having second thoughts. I've worked here for so long, he said. It feels wrong to leave like this. I looked at him. I saw the weariness in his eyes, the weight on his shoulders, the exhaustion of someone who works 2 jobs and still can barely make ends meet. You deserve better, I said. And wanting that isn't selfish. It's taking care of yourself. He was silent for a moment, and then he nodded. I think I needed to hear that. A few weeks later, he told me he had accepted the offer, that he would start the new job the following month. And for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled in a way that seemed genuine. Thank you, he said, for always believing that I could have something better. And when he said that, I realized something. I hadn't done anything grand. I hadn't given him money. I hadn't solved his problems. I had only seen him. I had recognized that he mattered. That what he was going through mattered. And sometimes that's all we need. Someone who sees. Someone who recognizes. Someone who says, you deserve more than this. Because we spend so much time thinking we don't deserve it, that we're not good enough, that we should be content with what we have. But that's not true. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be valued. Everyone deserves to have someone who believes in them, even when they can't believe in themselves. And when I did that for others, when I offered that, I realized I was healing myself too. I was healing that part of me that had spent years feeling invisible, irrelevant, without purpose. Because by seeing others, I was also learning to see myself. By valuing others, I was also learning to value myself, and that changed everything. One day, a few months after all that, I was sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, watching the sunrise. And I found myself thinking about how my life had changed, not in the facts. I still lived in the same place. I still had the same routine. I still faced the same daily challenges. But inside, I was a different person. I no longer felt alone. I no longer felt invisible. I no longer felt like I was just passing through life without leaving a mark. I knew now that everything I did mattered. Every word, every gesture, every moment of presence. Everything left a mark. On me, on others, on the world. And that awareness changed everything. I started living with more intention. Not in a heavy, burdened way, but in a conscious way. Knowing that every choice I made, no matter how small, had weight. And things continued to change. My daughter called me one day, thrilled. She had gotten a promotion at work. Mom, can you believe it? I thought it would never happen, but it did. We talked for almost an hour. She told me about the challenges she had faced, about the times she had thought about giving up, about how she had learned to believe in herself even when no one else did. And at the end of the conversation, she said something that surprised me. Mom, I think I learned that from you. With me? I asked, confused. Yes, in the last few months, I've seen you change. I've seen you open up. I've seen you start to believe that life can be different, and that inspired me. It made me think that I could too. I was speechless, because I had never thought that my change could affect her like that. I had never realized that by changing myself, I was also changing the people around me. Not for teaching, not for advising, but simply for being, for living life differently, for showing, through my actions, that it's possible. The young man from the bakery opened his own business, a small cafe. He invited me to the opening. You were one of the few people who always treated me with respect. I wish you were here. I went. And when I entered the place, I saw the pride on his face. I saw the hope. I saw the beginning of something new. And I felt grateful to have been a part of it, even if in a small way, even if only by being present. The neighbor started taking painting lessons, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the courage to. You showed me that there's still time, that life isn't over just because we've gotten old. And Regina started working as a volunteer in a support group for people with cancer. I want to be for others what you were for me, and each of those stories filled me with something I couldn't describe. It wasn't pride. It wasn't personal satisfaction. It was more like a connection. It's as if I've finally found my place in the world, not a physical place, but a place of purpose, of meaning. I was no longer just existing. I was living in truth. And it all started with 2 reais, with such a small gesture that I didn't even remember making it. But it had turned into something bigger than I could ever have imagined. Because that's what I was learning. Gestures don't need to be grand to be important. They just need to be truthful. They simply need to come from a place of presence, of attention, of genuine care. And when they form te multiply, they create waves that spread far beyond what we can see. A life full of people, full of connections, full of moments that mattered. Not because I had changed the external circumstances, but that's because I had changed on the inside. And as she changed from within, everything else had changed as well. Months have passed since that afternoon at the hospital. Months have passed since I discovered that a forgotten gesture had crossed time and returned to me when I needed it most. And since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking about how many other things we do fight to do that of that same or to change, touch, transform. Not in a flashy way. Not in a way that will appear in newspapers or become news, but in a real way, in a way that alters the course of a life without anyone noticing, until years later, perhaps, the pieces fall into place and we understand. I started paying even more attention, not only but in misel, based on what I felt, based on what I thought, based on what I chose to do at each moment, because I had realized something important. It wasn't just about the gestures I was making. It was about where those gestures came from. There were times in the past when I helped someone and felt a kind of burden, as if I were fulfilling an obligation, as if I were doing it because it was expected, because it was the right thing to do, but not because I really wanted to. And in those moments, even when the person thanked me, I felt nothing, just tiredness. Just the feeling of having given something I didn't have to give. But now it was different. Now, when I reached out to someone, I did it because I wanted to, because it made sense, because in some way it also fulfilled me. And the difference was enormous. It was as if the intention behind the gesture completely changed the effect it had on me and on the other person. One day, I was waiting for the bus at the same spot where it had all started years before. It was an ordinary afternoon. The bus stop was crowded, tired people returning from work, children returning from school, the constant noise of the city. And then I saw a woman. She must have been about 30, maybe younger. She was holding a child in her arms, carrying a heavy bag in one hand, and trying to hold onto the purse, which was falling off her shoulder. When the bus stopped, everyone started pushing. She tried to climb aboard, but the child was crying. The bag was slipping, and she clearly couldn't manage it. I didn't think twice. I approached, took her bag, held it firmly, and said, "Go up. I'll hold this for you." She looked at me, surprised, but went upstairs. She went through the turnstile. I went up right after her, handed her the bag, and she whispered a thank you so softly I almost didn't hear it. Premier ça te donne. She sat down with the child in her lap on the other side of the hallway. And for a second, I saw myself at that bus stop years ago, handing to coins to a desperate young man. And I wondered, will this woman remember this moment in a few years? Will this gesture, which lasted only a few seconds for me, mean anything to her? I didn't know. And I realized I didn't need to know. Because it wasn't about the outcome. It wasn't about whether it would make a difference or not. It was about doing, simply doing, and trust that, somehow, things will fall into place. When I got off the bus, I felt light. Not because I had done something great, but because I had done what seemed right. And that, in itself, was enough. In the following months, I continued living like that, paying attention, reaching out, being present. And the more I did that, the more I realized that it wasn't just other people's lives that were changing. It was mine too. I was sleeping better. I woke up with more energy. The things that used to make me anxious bills to pay, small problems, unexpected daily events no longer had the same impact. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because I was à calmer place mort sans te raide. I couldn't explain exactly what had changed. But première felt-it. It was as if, by helping others, by being there for others, I was also helping myself, healing myself in some way. One day, my daughter came to visit me. We were having tea in the living room, talking about life, about her work, about the plans she had. And suddenly, she stopped, looked at me attentively, and said, "Mom, you're different." I smiled. Different how? I can't explain it. More light, more present. Like you've found something you've been looking for a long time. And she was right. I had found it. Not a physical thing. Not a place. Not a definitive answer to all questions. But it was a way of life that made sense. A way of being in the world that made me feel whole. We talked for hours that day. She told me things she had never told me before. Fears, insecurities, dreams she had kept to herself because she thought they weren't realistic. And I just listened, just as I had listened to Regina. Just as I had listened to the boy from the bakery. Just as I had listened to the neighbor. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply be there. Without judging, without trying to fix things. Just be. And when she left, she hugged me tightly and said, "I love you, Mom, and I wanted you to know that you make a difference. In my life, in the lives of everyone around you." I cried after she left. Not sadness, but gratitude. Because for so long, I thought my life didn't matter. That I was just another person passing through the world without leaving a mark. And now I knew that wasn't true. Everything mattered. Every word, every gesture, every moment of presence, everything left a mark. And when we live knowing this, when we truly internalize it, our whole life changes. It was a few weeks later that I received a letter, not an email, not a message, a real letter, handwritten, delivered to my apartment. I opened it, curious, without knowing who it belonged to. And when I started reading, my heart raced. Dear lady, I don't know if you'll remember me. We met a few years ago at a bus stop. I was going to a job interview and didn't have enough money for the fare. You gave me Therese and said, "Here, go." I never forgot that moment. And I spent years wanting to thank you, but I didn't know how to find you. Until, by a twist of fate, you were admitted to the hospital where I work. And I was finally able to do for you what you did for me. But the reason for this letter is not just to say thank you. It's to tell you what happened next. Those Therese allowed me to get to the interview. I got the job. I started as an administrative assistant. Years later, I graduated as a doctor. And today, I work saving lives. But there's more. Since that day, I've carried with me the lesson I learned. Small gestures matter. And I make a point of practicing this every day. With patients, with colleagues, with strangers on the street. And recently, something happened that made me realize how widespread this lesson has become. I was attending to a patient who arrived at the hospital in critical condition. She had no family nearby. She had no one. She was alone and scared. I made a point of staying with her, of talking to her, of being there for her. She recovered. And before she was discharged, she told me something I'll never forget. You treated me like I mattered. And that made all the difference. This touched me deeply. And it made me realize that the gesture you made for me didn't stop with me. It spread. It continues to spread. Because I learned from her that kindness doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need recognition. It simply needs to exist. And now, whenever I help someone, I think about that morning at the bus stop. I think about how that woman changed my life without even knowing it. And I hope that, in some way, I am also changing the lives of other people. This letter is to say thank you. Not just for the two Riez, but for everything that came after. With eternal gratitude, Dr. Raphael the first read the letter 3 times. En des ashtim, she cried, stood. It wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what it had become. That gesture, those two Riez, had created a wave that had touched Raphael, who had touched his patient, which had probably touched other people I would never have met. And now, by living more consciously, more present, more available, I was creating more waves that would spread, touch other lives, create new gestures, and perhaps, in a few years, someone would look back and realize that a small moment that seemed insignificant at the time had changed everything. I kept the letter carefully. And that day, sitting on the porch, watching the sun set, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not the peace of someone who has all the answers. Not the peace of someone who has a perfect life, but the peace of someone who knows they are on the right path. Someone who is living in a way that is aligned with what truly matters. And that, in the end, is all we need. Because life isn't about great achievements. It's about small spirited love, with présence, with attention. It's about being available, being attentive, being there. And when we live like that, when we truly live that, life respond. Not in a perfect way, but in a real way, in a way that transforms. And in the end, that's what remains. It's not the money we accumulate. It's not the titles we win. It's not the possessions we leave behind, but the lives we touched, the gestures we made, the waves we created. And these waves keep coming long after we're gone. They continue to spread reaching new people, creating new gestures, and perhaps, just perhaps, making the world a little bit better, one gesture at a time. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone.